Hi, I'm Susan Parker. At my daughter's wedding, my in-laws seated me in the back row like I was some distant relative they barely knew. They whispered about the poor single mother who couldn't possibly understand their family's standards. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly writing checks for months, covering everything from the venue deposit to the flowers, because I wanted my Emily to have the wedding of her dreams. Sometimes the person you overlook is the one who made it all possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you! The morning light filtered through the cream-colored curtains of my modest kitchen on Oak Street, casting gentle shadows across the stack of wedding magazines that had taken over my dining table. I sat there with my coffee, the steam curling upward as I flipped through pages of elaborate centerpieces and designer gowns, each one more expensive than my monthly mortgage payment. But watching Emily's face light up whenever she talked about her upcoming wedding made every penny worth it. I had raised Emily alone since she was 7, after David decided that fatherhood cramped his style and moved to California with his secretary. Those early years as a single mother weren't easy. Working double shifts at Hartford Community Hospital, coming home exhausted to help with homework, juggling parent-teacher conferences with my nursing schedule. But Emily never went without. She had piano lessons, summer camps, and eventually, a college education that I paid for, one semester at a time. Now, at 25, she was radiant in a way that made my heart swell with pride. Her engagement to Michael Rodriguez had happened so fast it made my head spin. One day, she was complaining about her dating life. The next, she was showing me a ring that cost more than my annual salary. Michael seemed like a decent young man, though he came from a world so different from ours that sometimes I felt like I needed a translator. The Rodriguez family owned a successful import-export business that had been passed down through 3 generations. They lived in Maple Hill Estate, where the houses had circular driveways and gardens that required full-time groundskeepers. Patricia Rodriguez, Michael's mother, had a way of looking at me that made me feel like she was calculating my net worth and finding it disappointingly low. She spoke in clipped sentences about standards and family traditions that somehow always seemed to exclude me from the conversation. Emily burst through my front door that Tuesday morning in early March, wedding dress bag in one hand, coffee in the other, eyes bright with excitement and stress in equal measure. She spread herself across my couch, the way she used to when she was little and had something important to discuss. "Mom, we need to talk about the wedding budget," she said, and my stomach tightened the way it always did when money came up. Patricia has some thoughts about the reception menu, and she wants to upgrade a few things. I had learned to read between the lines when it came to Patricia's thoughts. They usually involved expensive upgrades that she assumed someone else would pay for. Emily pulled out her phone and started scrolling through messages, her brow furrowed with worry. She wants to change the chicken entree to filet mignon, add a raw bar for cocktail hour, and she's insisting on imported flowers instead of local ones. She says it's about making the right impression on Michael's business associates. Emily looked up at me with those green eyes that matched my own. I told her we'd need to check with you about the budget. The truth was, there was no budget left to check. I had already stretched my finances to the breaking point to give Emily the wedding she wanted. The venue deposit alone had cost me my entire savings account. The dress, the photographer, the band, the catering, the flowers, even the little details like the cardstock for the invitations. It had all come from my carefully managed finances, built up over years of living modestly and saving every extra dollar. I had kept quiet about the extent of my contributions because I didn't want Emily to feel guilty or indebted. She thought David was helping with costs, but his contribution had amounted to a check for $500 and a promise to pitch in more later that never materialized. She also assumed that Michael's family was covering certain expenses, but every time I asked about their contributions, the conversation somehow shifted to other topics. How much are we talking about for the upgrades? I asked, though I already knew the answer would make my head spin. Emily bit her lip, the way she did when she was about to deliver bad news. About $8,000. I know it's a lot, but Patricia says it's an investment in Michael's career. Apparently, his father's business partners will be there, and first impressions matter in their world. $8,000. That was more than I made in 2 months at the hospital. I looked at my daughter, saw the stress lines around her eyes, the way she was twisting her engagement ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed since the wedding planning began. This was supposed to be the happiest time of her life, not a source of constant anxiety about money and family politics. "Let me think about it," I said, which was my way of saying I'd figure out how to make it work. I always did. That evening, after Emily had gone home to Michael's apartment in Hartford, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and calculator, surrounded by bank statements and credit card offers. I had refinancing options on the house, a 401k I could borrow against, and a pride that seemed increasingly expensive to maintain. The wedding was only 6 weeks away, and somehow I would make sure Emily had everything she wanted. I called the wedding planner, Jennifer Walsh, the next morning during my break at the hospital. Jennifer had been professional but distant throughout the planning process, clearly more accustomed to dealing with clients who had unlimited budgets and family wealth to back them up. When I explained about the menu upgrades, her tone became noticeably cooler. "Mrs. Parker, we'll need the additional deposit by Friday to secure the upgraded catering package. The country club requires full payment 30 days before the event." She paused, and I could hear her typing. "I should mention that Mrs. Rodriguez called yesterday about floral arrangements. She wants to add some additional centerpieces and aisle decorations. That would be another $3,000. $3,000 on top of $8,000. $11,000 in upgrades that had been decided without consulting me, despite the fact that I was apparently expected to pay for them. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I used to get when Emily was little and needed something I couldn't afford. Back then, I'd found a way. I always found a way. "I'll have the deposit to you by Friday," I heard myself saying. That weekend, I drove to Emily's apartment to take her dress shopping for shoes. She lived with Michael in a sleek downtown Hartford complex with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who always made me feel underdressed. Emily met me in the lobby, looking gorgeous in jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. We spent the afternoon wandering through bridal boutiques, Emily trying on delicate heels, and me trying not to think about the credit card bills that would arrive next month. She found a perfect pair of ivory satin pumps with tiny pearl details that made her eyes sparkle. When the salesperson mentioned they could be dyed to match her bouquet, Emily clapped her hands together like she was still 7 years old on Christmas morning. "These are perfect, Mom. They're exactly what I pictured." She looked at the price tag and her face fell slightly. "But they're $300. Maybe I should look for something else." $300 for shoes she'd wear once. But seeing her face, the way she looked at those shoes like they were made of magic, I knew I couldn't say no. I handed my credit card to the salesperson before Emily could protest. "They're perfect," I said. "Consider them an early birthday present." Emily hugged me so tightly I could smell her shampoo, the same lavender scent she'd been using since high school. "I don't know how you do it, Mom. You always make everything work out." If only she knew how true that was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I had developed a talent for making the impossible possible, for stretching dollars until they screamed, for finding money in places I didn't know existed. It was a skill born of necessity and strengthened by love. On the drive home, Emily told me about her latest conversation with Patricia about the seating arrangements. Patricia had very specific ideas about where people should sit, based on their relation to the family and their social status. Emily's voice grew quieter as she explained that Patricia thought it would be more appropriate if I sat toward the back of the ceremony, since I was just the bride's mother and not immediate family to the groom. I told her that was ridiculous, Emily said quickly, but she said it was tradition in their family. The bride's parents sit on one side, groom's on the other, and since Dad isn't walking me down the aisle, there's no need for front row seating on our side. I kept my eyes on the road, counting to 10 before responding. David had refused to fly out for the wedding, claiming he couldn't take time off work, though his Facebook posts suggested he was planning a golf trip to Scottsdale the same weekend. I would be walking Emily down the aisle, something I was honored to do, but apparently that didn't earn me a front row seat in Patricia's world. "Where does she want me to sit?" I asked. "Fifth row. She says it's still a good view and it leaves room for Michael's extended family in the front rows." Emily's voice was strained. "I'm going to talk to her again. This is my wedding too." But I could hear the defeat in her voice. Emily had been fighting small battles with Patricia for months, over the menu, the music, the guest list, even the style of her hair for the ceremony. Each disagreement left Emily more exhausted and less excited about what should have been the happiest day of her life. I decided then that I wouldn't be another source of stress for her. "Fifth row is fine. Honey, I'll have a perfect view of you, and that's all that matters." The relief in Emily's voice was immediate. "Are you sure? I can insist if you want me to." "I'm sure. This day is about you and Michael, not seating politics." That night, I sat in my bedroom with my laptop, transferring money from my savings to checking, calculating how much I could charge to credit cards without defaulting, looking at the equity in my house. The wedding budget spreadsheet I'd created had grown into a complex document with multiple tabs for different expenses. Every time I thought I had everything covered, another cost appeared. I opened my email to find a message from Jennifer Walsh, with an updated timeline and vendor contact list. Scanning through it, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Next to each vendor was listed who had made the payments and when. Venue, Susan Parker. Catering, Susan Parker. Photography, Susan Parker. Flowers, Susan Parker. Band, Susan Parker. Almost every line item showed my name as the paying party. The only exceptions were the wedding invitations, which David had covered, and the rehearsal dinner, which the Rodriguez family had offered to host. Looking at it laid out like that, the scope of my financial contribution was staggering. I had paid for nearly the entire wedding. I closed the laptop and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the modest neighborhood where I'd raised Emily. The houses were older, the yards smaller, the cars in the driveways more practical than impressive. This was my world, and I had never been ashamed of it. But lately, I found myself seeing it through Patricia's eyes, imagining her judgment, feeling inadequate in ways I hadn't experienced since those early days of single motherhood. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final fittings, last minute, vendor confirmations, and increasingly frantic phone calls from Emily about details that Patricia wanted to change. Each modification came with a cost, and each cost somehow became my responsibility. The raw bar became a sushi station. The local flowers became imported orchids. The standard linens became hand-embroidered specialty tablecloths. I stopped answering my phone during work hours because the calls from vendors and wedding planners were becoming too frequent. My colleagues at the hospital began to notice my distraction. Margaret Chen, my closest friend among the nursing staff, cornered me during our lunch break on a particularly stressful Thursday. "Susan, what's going on? You've been running yourself ragged for weeks, and you look like you haven't slept in days." Maggie had been my friend for 15 years. She'd seen me through Emily's teenage years, my mother's death, and countless hospital crises. She had a way of seeing through my careful composure to the worry underneath. "Just wedding stress," I said, picking at the salad I'd brought from home to save money. "You know how it is." No, I don't know how it is. My daughter's wedding cost $8,000 total, and that included the dress. What's really going on? I found myself telling her everything. About Patricia's constant upgrades, about being relegated to the back row, about the credit cards I'd maxed out and the equity loan I'd taken on my house. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop. The words poured out like water from a broken dam, carrying with them months of frustration and financial worry. Maggie listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. When I finished, she shook her head slowly. Susan, do you realize what you just told me? You've paid for an entire wedding for a family that treats you like a second-class citizen. Where's Emily's father in all this? Where's the groom's family? David sent a check for $500. The Rodriguez family is hosting the rehearsal dinner. I said it defensively, though even to my own ears it sounded pathetic. A $500 check for his daughter's wedding? And the rehearsal? Dinner probably costs less than what you spent on flowers alone. Maggie leaned forward. Honey, you're being taken advantage of. Does Emily even know how much you've spent? The truth was, Emily didn't know. She knew I was contributing, but she had no idea about the loans, the credit cards, the sleepless nights spent figuring out how to make the numbers work. I had hidden the financial strain the same way I'd hidden it when she was young and wanted, things we couldn't afford. It had become second nature to me, this protection through concealment. She can't know, I said finally. This is her dream wedding. I won't let money stress ruin it for her. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. But what about you? What happens to you after the wedding when the bills come due? I didn't have an answer for that. I'd been so focused on getting through the wedding day that I hadn't really thought about the aftermath. The reality was that I'd be paying for Emily's wedding for years to come, and Emily would never know the sacrifices I'd made. The final week before the wedding passed in a haze of last-minute preparations and growing anxiety. My phone rang constantly, with vendor confirmations, timeline adjustments, and updates from the wedding planner. Emily called twice daily with questions about details I'd already handled months ago. She seemed increasingly stressed about the family dynamics, telling me about arguments between Patricia and Michael about the guest list, about Patricia's criticism of everything from Emily's makeup trial to the choice of wedding favors. 2 days before the wedding, I received a call from Frank Morrison, the manager at Willowbrook Country Club. His voice was formally polite, but carried an undercurrent of confusion. Mrs. Parker, I'm calling to confirm the final details for the Parker Rodriguez wedding this Saturday. I have a few questions about the payment arrangements. I was at work, standing in a supply closet, trying to have a private conversation while my shift continued around me. What kind of questions? Well, according to our records, you've been the primary point of contact for all financial matters. However, Mrs. Rodriguez called this morning insisting that there must be some mistake, as her family has been handling all wedding expenses. My hands started to shake. What exactly did she say? She wanted to review the payment history and seemed surprised that your name was on all the receipts. She asked me to send her a detailed breakdown of all transactions. Frank paused. I told her I couldn't release financial information without your authorization, since you're the account holder. Patricia was investigating the payments. After months of acting like the wedding expenses were being handled by mysterious others, she was finally looking into who had actually been paying for everything. Part of me felt vindicated. Finally, someone would know exactly how much I'd contributed. But another part of me felt exposed, like a secret I'd been carefully keeping was about to be blown wide open. Did you send her the information? I asked. No, as I said, I need your authorization first. But Mrs. Parker, if I may ask, is there some confusion about the payment arrangements? In my experience, it's unusual for one party to handle all expenses, while another family believes they're responsible. There was no confusion, just willful ignorance and assumptions that had never been corrected. I asked Frank to hold off on sending any information to Patricia until after the wedding. I needed to think about how to handle this revelation, and I didn't want it to become a source of drama in the final days before Emily's wedding. That evening, I stood in my bedroom looking at the navy blue dress I'd bought for the wedding. It was elegant but understated, appropriate for sitting in the fifth row while Patricia commanded attention from the front in what Emily had described as a stunning silver gown that cost more than most people's cars. I tried on the dress more time, looking at myself in the mirror and trying to imagine sitting quietly in the back while Patricia received compliments on the beautiful wedding her family had provided. For the first time since this whole process began, I felt angry. Not hurt or disappointed or stressed, but genuinely angry. I had given everything to make Emily's dream wedding possible, and I was being treated like a charity case who should be grateful for the privilege of attending. Tomorrow would be my daughter's wedding day, and instead of feeling joy and pride, I felt like an outsider to an event I had created. I picked up my phone and started typing a text to Emily, then deleted. It had started typing a text to Patricia, then deleted that too. Started typing a text to Michael, thinking maybe he didn't know how his mother was treating me, then deleted that as well. There was nothing to say that wouldn't create drama on the eve of the wedding. Instead, I walked to my kitchen table where my wedding planning folder lay open, filled with copies of receipts, contracts, and payment confirmations. I had kept meticulous records of every expense, every vendor, every upgrade requested and paid for. Looking at it now, it read like a detailed accounting of my love for Emily, measured in dollars and cents. Tomorrow I would sit in the fifth row at Willowbrook Country Club and watch my daughter marry the man she loved in the wedding of her dreams. I would smile and celebrate and take pictures and pretend that my heart wasn't breaking a little. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to make sure the truth came out. Not to hurt Emily or ruin her day, but because sometimes the person who sacrifices everything deserves to be acknowledged for their love. I closed the folder and went to bed, setting my alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow would be Emily's perfect day, and I intended to make sure it stayed that way, no matter what it cost, me personally. But I also made a decision as I drifted off to sleep. I wouldn't let myself be invisible anymore. The woman who had made this day possible deserved better than a back row seat and whispered assumptions about what she could or couldn't afford. Tomorrow, the truth would find a way to shine through. The morning of Emily's wedding dawned with the kind of crisp May sunshine that made everything look like it belonged in a magazine. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug warming my hands, watching the neighbors' sprinklers create tiny rainbows across their perfectly manicured lawns. In a few hours, I would be sitting in the back of Willowbrook Country Club, watching my daughter say her vows in a dress that had taken me 3 months to pay off. My phone had been buzzing since 5:30 with messages from vendors, confirmations from the florist, and updates from Jennifer Walsh about timeline adjustments. Each notification made my stomach tighten a little more. This was the day I had worked toward for 8 months, the culmination of countless nights spent budgeting and rebudgeting, transferring money between accounts, and praying that my credit cards wouldn't be declined. Emily arrived at my house at 7, her hair in rollers and her face glowing with that special radiance brides are supposed to have. She burst through my door carrying a garment bag, makeup case, and enough nervous energy to power the entire neighborhood. Behind her came Dr. Sarah Kim, Emily's godmother and my oldest friend from nursing school. Sarah had flown in from Seattle specifically for the wedding, and seeing her familiar face in the chaos of the morning felt like finding an anchor in a storm. "Mom, I need you to help me stay calm today," Emily said, spreading her things across my living room. I barely slept last night. I kept dreaming that something would go wrong, that the flowers wouldn't arrive, or the band would cancel, or Patricia would find some reason to criticize everything. Sarah raised an eyebrow at this. Last comment. Over the years, I had shared enough stories about Patricia's behavior that Sarah understood the family dynamics. though she had never met the woman in person. Sarah had a way of cutting through nonsense that I sometimes envied. Where I tended to accommodate and smooth over conflicts, Sarah addressed them head-on. "Has Patricia been giving you trouble?" Sarah asked, settling into my armchair with her own cup of coffee. Emily hesitated, glancing at me before answering. "It's not trouble, exactly. She just has very specific ideas about how things should be done. She keeps reminding me that her family knows important people who will be at the reception, and she wants everything to reflect well on them." The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia was worried about making a good impression with a wedding she hadn't paid for, while treating the person who had made it all possible like an inconvenience. I bit my tongue and focused on making Emily's morning as stress-free as possible. We spent the next 2 hours transforming my modest living room into a bridal preparation suite. Sarah proved invaluable, keeping Emily distracted with stories from our nursing school days while I helped with hair and makeup. Emily had chosen to get ready at my house instead of at the country club, saying she wanted these quiet moments before the chaos of the day began. I was grateful for this decision, as it meant I could see her off properly before assuming my assigned role in the background. As Emily slipped into her wedding dress, I felt that familiar tightness in my throat that came whenever I realized how grown-up she had become. The dress was everything she had dreamed of. Ivory silk with delicate lace detailing, a train that would photograph beautifully against the country club's gardens. It had cost $4,000, money I had borrowed against my retirement account. But seeing her face as she looked at herself in my full-length mirror made every sacrifice worthwhile. "You look absolutely breathtaking," I whispered, unable to trust my voice to remain steady if I spoke any louder. Emily turned to me, tears threatening to spill over and ruin the makeup we had just carefully applied. "I can't believe this day is finally here." "Thank you for everything, Mom. I know it hasn't been easy planning all this, especially with Patricia's opinions about everything." She had no idea how true that statement was. Emily knew I had been contributing financially to the wedding, but she assumed it was a shared expense among family members. She had never asked for details about the budget, trusting that the adults were handling things appropriately. This trust, which I had always encouraged, now felt like a burden. She was thanking me for everything, without knowing what everything actually entailed. At 10 o'clock, Michael arrived to see Emily before the ceremony, a tradition that Patricia had initially objected to as bad luck before Emily put her foot down. Michael looked handsome in his tuxedo, nervous in the endearing way of grooms everywhere. He took one look at Emily, and his face lit up with such genuine joy that I felt some of my morning anxiety ease. Whatever else was complicated about this situation, there was no question that these two young people loved each other deeply. After Michael left to get ready for photographs, Sarah helped me pack Emily's things for the transition to the country club. As we worked, Sarah kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, she pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Susan, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "How much of this wedding are you actually paying for?" I started to give my standard vague answer about contributing my share, but something in Sarah's expression made me stop. She was looking at me the way she used to during our clinical rotations, when she suspected a patient wasn't telling her the whole truth about their symptoms. "All of it," I said quietly. "I've paid for all of it." Sarah stared at me for a long moment. "Susan, what does all of it mean? The dress? The venue? The venue? The catering? The band? The photographer? The flowers? Emily's dress? The invitations? Except for printing costs that David covered. The transportation, the decorations, even the upgrades that Patricia insisted on over the past month." The words came out in a rush, as if admitting the truth out loud made it more real. "The only thing I haven't paid for is the rehearsal dinner, which the Rodriguez family is hosting tonight." Sarah sat down heavily at my kitchen table. "How much money are we talking about, Susan?" I had been avoiding this calculation, but Sarah's direct question forced me to face the numbers. $67,000, not including the upgrades Patricia wanted in the last few weeks. Those added another $11,000. $78,000, Sarah repeated slowly. Susan, that's more than you make in a year. The weight of that number hung in the air between us. I had known it intellectually, but hearing it, spoken aloud, made my financial situation sound even more desperate than it felt. I had liquidated my retirement savings, taken a second mortgage on my house, and maxed out every credit card I could qualify for. The monthly payments alone would stretch my budget to the breaking point for years to come. "Does Emily know?" Sarah asked. "She knows I'm contributing, but not how much. She thinks everyone is pitching in appropriately. She's got enough stress, without worrying about money. And the groom's family? They really believe their money is paying for this?" I explained about Patricia's assumptions, her constant references to making the right impression and family standards, her apparent shock when the country club manager mentioned my name on all the payment records. Sarah listened with growing incredulity. "You mean to tell me that woman has been criticizing details of a wedding she hasn't paid a dime for? That she's been treating you like hired help at an event you financed entirely yourself?" Put that way, the situation sounded even more absurd than it felt. I had become so accustomed to Patricia's attitude that I had stopped questioning whether it was reasonable. Her comments about my modest means and her concerns about me understanding their social expectations had gradually worn down my confidence over the months of wedding planning. "I don't want to make waves," I said. "Today is Emily's day." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Susan, you are one of the most generous people I know, but this isn't generosity anymore. This is being taken advantage of on a massive scale. What happens after today? How are you going to manage financially?" I had been avoiding thinking about that question for months. The truth was that I would probably be paying for Emily's wedding. Until I retired, maybe longer. I would need to work extra shifts at the hospital, give up any hope of vacation or home improvements, and live even more frugally than I already did. But that seemed like a problem for tomorrow. "I'll figure it out," I said, which was my standard response to financial worries. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then she reached across the table and took my hand. "What time do the vendors arrive at the country club?" "Most of them started setting up at 6 this morning. The flowers should be arriving around 11, and the band will start their sound check at noon." "And what time does the photographer want family pictures?" 1 o'clock for family photos, then Emily and Michael are doing their couples shots at 2. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "So Patricia and her family will be interacting with vendors for several hours before the ceremony." "I assume so. Why?" "Because those vendors know who paid their invoices. If Patricia starts asking questions or trying to take credit for arrangements, they might have some interesting conversations." A flutter of anxiety mixed with anticipation stirred in my chest. I had spent so much energy protecting everyone from the truth about the wedding finances that I hadn't considered what might happen if that truth came out naturally. The vendors had all dealt with me directly. My name was on every contract, every payment confirmation, every change order. If Patricia tried to present herself as the primary client, she would quickly discover that none of the professionals involved in the wedding had ever heard from her. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, radiant in her wedding dress, holding her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. The flowers had cost $800, another expense I had absorbed without comment. She looked so beautiful, so happy, that I felt my protective instincts override any thoughts of financial revelations. "The car is here to take us to the country club," she announced. "Are you ready, Mom?" I looked at my daughter, stunning in her dream dress, preparing to marry the man she loved in the perfect venue surrounded by gorgeous flowers and elegant decorations. Everything she had wanted for her special day had been provided for her. That was what mattered. not who got credit or recognition. "I'm ready," I said, gathering my purse and the small bag of emergency items every mother brings to a wedding. The ride to Willowbrook Country Club took 15 minutes through Riverside's tree-lined streets. Emily chattered nervously about last-minute details, while I watched familiar neighborhoods pass by the window. Soon we would arrive at the venue, where Patricia would assume her role as mother of the groom, accepting compliments on the beautiful arrangements and elegant reception, while I took my designated seat in the 5th row. As we approached the country club's elegant entrance, I saw vendors unloading equipment, staff members arranging chairs in the garden ceremony space, and early guests beginning to arrive. In just a few hours, Emily would walk down an aisle decorated with flowers I had chosen, surrounded by guests who would eat food I had selected, entertained by musicians I had hired, in a venue I had booked and paid for in full. The car pulled up to the entrance, and I helped Emily gather her dress train as we prepared to enter the venue. This was the moment when my months of behind-the-scenes work would fade into the background, when Patricia would step forward to receive credit for the elegant event, when I would become just another wedding guest relegated to the back row. But as we walked through the doors of Willowbrook Country Club, I noticed the florist rushing toward us with a concerned expression. Behind her, I could see Patricia standing near the reception hall entrance, her face flushed with what appeared to be anger or embarrassment. Something was already happening, and the ceremony hadn't even begun. "Mrs. Parker," the florist called out, slightly out of breath. "I'm so glad you're here. There seems to be some confusion about the flower arrangements. The mother of the groom is asking us to make changes, but our contract is with you, and we can't authorize modifications without your approval." Emily looked puzzled. "What kind of changes?" Before I could respond, Patricia appeared at our side, her polite wedding smile not quite hiding the tension in her voice. "Oh, good, you're here. I was just discussing some aesthetic improvements with the vendors, small adjustments to make everything more cohesive." The florist looked between Patricia and me uncertainly. As I explained to Mrs. Rodriguez, any changes to the arrangements would need approval from Mrs. Parker since she's the client on our contract. I watched Patricia's face carefully, seeing the moment when she fully realized what the florist was saying. Her smile became more strained, and she looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been suspicion. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about the arrangements," Patricia said slowly. "Our families have been coordinating the details together." The florist, clearly uncomfortable with the family politics suddenly swirling around her, looked to me for guidance. "Should I proceed with the original arrangements as contracted, Mrs. Parker?" "Yes, please," I said firmly. "Everything should be exactly as we planned." As the florist hurried away, Patricia continued to stare at me with that same puzzled expression. I could practically see her mental calculations as she tried to reconcile her assumptions about the wedding finances with what she was hearing from the vendors. Emily, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "Mom, I'm going to find the bridal suite to touch up my makeup. Can you handle things out here?" "Of course, honey. I'll make sure everything is running smoothly." After Emily left, Patricia and I stood facing each other in the country club's elegant foyer. The silence stretched between us, filled with unasked questions and avoided truths. Finally, Patricia spoke. "Mrs. Parker, I think we should have a conversation about the vendor arrangements. There seems to be some confusion about who they should be taking direction from today." I looked at this woman who had spent months treating me like a poor relation, while assuming someone else was paying for her son's wedding. Part of me felt sorry for her. The embarrassment of discovering her mistake must have been unpleasant. But a larger part of me felt tired of accommodating her assumptions and managing her discomfort. "There's no confusion," I said quietly. "The vendors are taking direction from me because I'm the one who hired them." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And exactly how many vendors are you directing today?" Before I could answer, Jennifer Walsh approached us with her clipboard and headset, looking frazzled in the way wedding planners do in the final hours before an event. "Mrs. Parker, thank goodness you're here. We have the timeline finalized, but I need to confirm the music selections with you for the reception. Also, the caterer has a question about the champagne service during cocktail hour." Patricia stepped forward. "I can handle those details." Jennifer looked confused. "I'm sorry, but I need approval from the client. Mrs. Parker is listed as the primary contact for all vendor decisions." The color drained from Patricia's face. I could see her beginning to understand the scope of what she hadn't known, the extent of what she had assumed was being handled by others. The beautiful wedding she had been anticipating taking partial credit for was entirely the result of my planning and paying. "Perhaps we should discuss this after the ceremony," I suggested, not wanting the morning to devolve into financial revelations that might upset Emily. Patricia nodded stiffly, but I could see her mind working, putting together pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed. As we stood there in the foyer of Willowbrook Country Club, surrounded by the elegant decorations and floral arrangements I had chosen and paid for, I realized that the careful fiction I had maintained for months was beginning to unravel. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially on days when everyone is paying close attention to details. Today was going to be Emily's perfect wedding day, but it was also going to be the day when everyone learned exactly who had made that perfection possible. The ceremony was still 2 hours away, but already the facade was cracking. Soon, everyone would know exactly what I had sacrificed to give Emily her dream wedding, and I was beginning to realize that maybe that wasn't such a terrible thing after all. The bridal suite at Willowbrook Country Club was everything Emily had dreamed of. A spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, elegant furniture in soft pastels, and perfect lighting for final preparations. Emily sat at the vanity mirror while her college roommate Jessica applied final touches to her makeup. The room buzzed with the excited chatter of bridesmaids discussing timeline details and complimenting each other's dresses. I stood by the window, watching staff members arrange chairs in the garden ceremony space below. Each white chair had been individually placed according to the seating chart that Patricia had so carefully orchestrated, with my name relegated to the 5th row. From this vantage point, I could see the elegant floral arrangements being positioned. At the altar, white roses, peonies, and baby's breath in tall crystal vases that had cost more per arrangement than I used to spend on groceries in a month. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Jennifer Walsh entered, looking more frazzled than I had ever seen her. Her usually perfect composure was showing cracks, and she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. "Mrs. Parker, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Emily looked up from the mirror. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I assured her. "Just some typical last-minute coordination details." I followed Jennifer into the hallway, where she immediately began speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Mrs. Parker, we have a situation. Mrs. Rodriguez has been going through the venue questioning various arrangements. She asked the caterer to change the menu setup, which they refused to do without your authorization. She tried to relocate the guest book table, but the staff told her all furniture placement was per your specifications. She even attempted to alter the music selection with the band leader, who informed her that their contract and payment came from you." My stomach tightened. How is she reacting to this information? She's becoming increasingly agitated. She keeps insisting there must be some error in the vendor communications. She asked me directly who was responsible for overall event coordination, and when I told her you were my primary client contact, she demanded to see the contracts. I could picture Patricia's growing frustration as each vendor confirmed what she was obviously hoping wasn't true. For months, she had operated under the assumption that someone else, probably some combination of family contributions, was handling the financial aspects of the wedding while she focused on the social and aesthetic elements. What did you tell her about the contracts? I explained that client confidentiality prevents me from sharing financial documents without your explicit permission. But Mrs. Parker, she's not accepting that answer well. She's currently in the business office demanding to speak with Frank Morrison about the payment arrangements. Frank Morrison was the venue manager who had called me earlier in the week about Patricia's inquiries. I had asked him to hold off on sharing financial information, but if Patricia was confronting him directly on the wedding day, he might feel obligated to provide some answers. Where is Mr. Morrison now? He's trying to handle the situation diplomatically, but Mrs. Rodriguez is quite insistent. She's suggesting there's been some sort of fraudulent activity or identity confusion regarding the account. The word fraudulent sent a chill through me. Patricia wasn't just confused anymore. She was actively questioning the legitimacy of the arrangements. In her mind, there had to be some explanation for why her son's wedding appeared to be entirely financed and controlled by someone she considered beneath her family's social standing. I should probably speak with her directly, I said, though every instinct told me to avoid that confrontation on Emily's wedding day. Mrs. Parker, there's something else. The photographer arrived early to scout lighting, and Mrs. Rodriguez approached him about changing the family portrait arrangements. When he explained that you had specified the groupings and timeline, she became quite upset. He mentioned that she made some rather disparaging comments about people overstepping their boundaries. I felt my jaw clench. In the midst of discovering that I had paid for everything, Patricia still couldn't resist making snide remarks about my place in the family hierarchy. Her shock at learning the truth hadn't translated into embarrassment or gratitude, but rather into indignation that I had somehow deceived her. I'll handle this, I said finally. Please make sure Emily isn't disturbed by any of this. Whatever happens, I want her day to remain perfect. Jennifer nodded sympathetically. Of course. But Mrs. Parker, you should know that word is spreading among the staff. When vendors work an event, they talk to each other. By this afternoon, everyone involved in this wedding will know exactly who paid for what. As if summoned by our conversation, Frank Morrison appeared at the end of the hallway, walking briskly toward us with an expression that suggested he had reached the limit of his patience. Behind him, Patricia followed, her elegant silver gown rustling with each determined step. Her face was flushed, and her carefully styled hair showed signs of stress-induced touching. Mrs. Parker, Frank said as he approached, I'm afraid we need to resolve some confusion immediately. Mrs. Rodriguez is questioning the legitimacy of our account arrangements, and her accusations are becoming disruptive to our staff's preparation efforts. Patricia stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Mrs. Parker, I demand an explanation for what appears to be a serious misunderstanding about this wedding's financial arrangements. Every vendor I've spoken with seems to believe you are the primary client, which is obviously impossible. The word impossible hung in the air between us. Impossible because someone like me couldn't afford such an elegant wedding. Impossible because someone of my social standing shouldn't be making decisions about an event involving her family. Impossible because she had spent months operating under assumptions that were now proving to be entirely false. There's no misunderstanding, I said quietly. I am the primary client because I'm the one who arranged and paid for everything. Patricia's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. That's preposterous. The cost of a wedding at this venue alone is well beyond. I mean, surely there's been some administrative error. Even in her shock, she couldn't bring herself to directly acknowledge what she really meant. That someone like me couldn't possibly afford what someone like her considered appropriate for her family. Frank Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Parker, would you like me to provide Mrs. Rodriguez with a summary of the account activity? It might help clarify the situation. I looked at Patricia's face, seeing the desperate hope that somehow the numbers would prove her right, that there had been some mistake that would restore her worldview to its proper order. Part of me felt sorry for her embarrassment, but Larger part of me was tired of protecting her from the truth. "Yes," I said. "I think it's time everything was clear." Oh, Frank pulled out his tablet and began reading in a matter-of-fact voice that somehow made the figures more stark. The Willowbrook Country Club charges for the Parker Rodriguez wedding total $78,437. This includes the ceremony site, reception venue, catering for 150 guests with menu upgrades, upgraded linens, enhanced lighting package, and additional floral arrangements requested in March and April. Patricia's face grew paler with each item. But surely multiple parties contributed to that total. No, ma'am. All payments came from Mrs. Parker's accounts. We have records of 12 separate transactions over the past 6 months, including the final payment that cleared just last week. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the distant sounds of wedding preparations, staff moving chairs, vendors calling out instructions, the faint sound of the band running a sound check. Normal wedding day activities continuing while Patricia's understanding of the world shifted fundamentally. "This must be some kind of mistake," she said weakly, but the conviction had gone out of her voice. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward diplomatically. "Perhaps this conversation would be better continued after the ceremony. We should focus on ensuring the day proceeds smoothly for Emily and Michael." Patricia nodded absently, looking like someone who had just learned that gravity worked differently than she had always believed. I watched her struggle to reconcile the reality of the financial arrangements with her months of assumptions and commentary about my limitations. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I said gently, "I understand this is surprising, but I hope you can appreciate that everything was done to ensure Emily and Michael had the wedding they wanted." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not the polite condescension or barely veiled criticism I had grown accustomed to, but something approaching awe mixed with deep embarrassment. "I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us?" Before I could answer, Emily's voice called out from the bridal suite. "Mom, is everything okay out there?" "Everything's fine, sweetie," I called back. "Just some vendor coordination." Patricia straightened her shoulders and seemed to pull herself together with visible effort. "We should discuss this further after the ceremony," she said stiffly. "Today should be about the children." As she walked away, her silver gown catching the light from the hallway chandeliers, I realized that our conversation had resolved nothing. If anything, it had created more questions and tensions that would need to be addressed eventually. But for now, I had to focus on getting through the wedding ceremony without allowing the financial revelations to overshadow Emily's happiness. Frank Morrison lingered for a moment after Patricia left. "Mrs. Parker, in my 20 years managing events here, I've never quite seen a situation like this. I hope this doesn't create any problems for your family." "I hope so too," I replied, though I suspected the problems were just beginning. Back in the bridal suite, Emily was putting the finishing touches on her appearance while her bridesmaids fussed over details. She looked radiant, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded in the hallway. Seeing her happiness, I made a decision to compartmentalize my worries. Whatever conversation awaited with Patricia after the ceremony, whatever financial discussions needed to happen with Emily eventually, whatever family dynamics had been permanently altered by today's revelations, none of that mattered right now. Right now, my daughter was about to marry the man she loved in the wedding of her dreams. Everything else could wait. Sarah caught my eye from across the room where she was adjusting her dress for the ceremony. She raised an eyebrow questioningly, and I gave her a small shake of my head to indicate that I would explain later. Sarah had always been good at reading my expressions, and she seemed to understand that this wasn't the time for questions. At 12:30, Jennifer Walsh returned to escort the bridal party to the ceremony site. Emily took one final look at herself in the full-length mirror, a vision in ivory silk and lace, holding the bouquet of white roses that had cost $800 and looked like a piece of art. "I can't believe this moment is finally here," she said, her voice slightly breathless with excitement and emotion. Neither could I. After months of secret financial maneuvering, vendor coordination, and family diplomacy, we had arrived at the moment when all the planning would culminate in the ceremony Emily had envisioned. As we prepared to leave the bridal suite, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, a woman in a navy blue dress who had given everything to make this day possible. The ceremony garden was transformed into something magical. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, an arch covered in climbing roses framing the altar, and small details that spoke to the love and care that had gone into every decision. I walked out with the wedding party, taking my designated seat in the 5th row, while Patricia and her family were escorted to the front. From my seat, I had a clear view of Emily as she appeared at the top of the garden steps, her hand on my father's arm. He had flown in from Florida specifically to walk her down the aisle, one of the few family traditions we had preserved from the original wedding plans. As they began their procession down the rose-petal-strewn aisle, I felt tears building in my eyes. Every flower they passed, every decoration that framed their walk, every elegant detail that created the magical atmosphere. All of it had been my gift to Emily, given quietly and without expectation of recognition. Watching her float down that aisle in her dream dress, I felt a deep satisfaction that transcended the financial stress and family complications. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Emily and Michael's vows were personal and heartfelt, bringing tears to many eyes among the guests. The minister spoke about love, commitment, and the importance of family support in marriage. As I listened to these words while sitting in my back row seat, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of how family support was actually playing out in our situation. When the ceremony concluded with the kiss and the joyful recessional, guests began moving toward the cocktail reception area. I remained seated for a moment, watching the bridal party pose for photographs in front of the floral arrangements I had selected. The photographer moved efficiently, capturing the formal shots that would preserve these memories forever. As I finally stood to join the cocktail reception, I noticed Patricia watching me from across the garden. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw a mixture of emotions cross her face: embarrassment, confusion, and perhaps a dawning respect. She looked away quickly, turning her attention to greeting guests and accepting congratulations on the beautiful ceremony. The cocktail hour was held on the country club's terrace, overlooking manicured gardens and a small lake. Staff members circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, everything perfectly executed according to the specifications I had approved months earlier. I mingled politely with guests, accepting compliments on Emily's happiness and the elegance of the venue. Several people mentioned how beautiful the flowers were, how delicious the food looked, how perfectly everything was coordinated. Each compliment was delivered with the assumption that multiple families had contributed to creating this perfection, unaware that one person had quietly made it all possible. Dr. Sarah Kim found me standing near the terrace railing, watching Emily and Michael pose for couples photos by the lake. Her expression was knowing and sympathetic. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. "Whatever happens next, Emily is happy. That's what matters." "And Patricia? How is she handling her new understanding of the situation?" I glanced across the terrace to where Patricia stood surrounded by relatives, her smile bright but slightly strained. "Still processing, I think. This can't be easy for her." Sarah followed my gaze. "It's not easy for you either. You've just had your entire contribution to this day acknowledged after months of being treated like a secondary participant." She was right, though I hadn't quite let myself feel the full weight of that validation yet. For so long, I had focused on staying in the background, making sure everything went smoothly without drawing attention to my role. Now that the truth was emerging, I wasn't sure how to handle being seen clearly for the first time. The reception dinner was scheduled to begin in an hour, followed by dancing and celebration that would continue into the evening. I knew that, Eventually, I would need to have a more complete conversation with Patricia about the financial arrangements. Emily would also need to understand the full scope of what I had done, though I hoped that conversation could wait until after the honeymoon. For now, I was content to stand on the terrace of Willowbrook Country Club, watching my daughter celebrate the beginning of her married life in surroundings that exceeded her wildest dreams. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the gardens and lake, creating the perfect backdrop for what had indeed turned out to be a perfect wedding day. The truth about who had made this perfection possible was finally beginning to emerge, and surprisingly, the sky hadn't fallen. If anything, I felt a sense of relief that the careful facade I had maintained for months was no longer necessary. The woman who had sacrificed everything for this day was finally being recognized, even if that recognition came with its own complications. Tonight, Emily would dance her first dance as a married woman in a ballroom I had booked, surrounded by decorations I had chosen, eating cake I had ordered. And for the first time in months, I wouldn't have to pretend that someone else had made it all happen. The reception dinner began with all the elegance I had envisioned when I first toured Willowbrook Country Club 8 months ago. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in ivory linens with gold accents. Each centerpiece a masterpiece of white roses and greenery that complemented the ceremony decorations perfectly. Emily and Michael sat at the head table, glowing with happiness as guests found their assigned seats according to Patricia's carefully orchestrated seating chart. I made my way to table 12, positioned toward the back of the reception hall where Patricia had deemed appropriate for the bride's mother. My table companions were a mix of Emily's college friends' parents and some distant relatives from David's side of the family. They were pleasant enough people, though our conversations remained politely superficial as we all focused on the spectacle unfolding at the front of the room. From my vantage point, I could see Patricia at the family table, her silver gown catching the light as she gestured animatedly to the guests around her. Despite the afternoon's revelations, she seemed determined to maintain her role as the gracious mother of the groom, accepting compliments on the beautiful reception with practiced smiles. I watched her navigate conversations with the skill of someone accustomed to social performance, even as I suspected her composure was more fragile than it appeared. The first course arrived with military precision, servers appearing simultaneously. At every table with plates of seared scallops arranged artistically with microgreens and a citrus reduction. I had chosen this menu after weeks of tastings with the catering manager, selecting each dish based on both Emily's preferences and the sophisticated presentation that would photograph well. The food was exquisite, each bite justifying the premium. I had paid for the upgraded menu that Patricia had insisted upon. As dinner progressed through multiple courses, I found myself observing the seamless execution of every detail I had planned. The timing was perfect, the service professional, the atmosphere exactly what Emily had dreamed of for her wedding. Guests complimented the food, the ambiance, the attention to detail, their praise floating over me like distant applause for a performance I had directed but wasn't supposed to be credited for. During the salad course, I noticed a commotion at the bar area. Carlos Martinez, the photographer I had hired, was in animated conversation with Patricia and several other family members. Their voices were too low for me to hear from across the room, but their body language suggested tension. Patricia kept gesturing toward the head table while Carlos shook his head and pointed to his camera equipment. Sarah, who was seated at a nearby table with other family friends, caught my attention and nodded toward the bar scene. She raised her eyebrows in question, and I shrugged slightly, unsure what was transpiring but having a growing suspicion it related to the ongoing revelations about the wedding's financial arrangements. The mystery resolved itself when Jennifer Walsh approached my table during the transition between courses. Her professional smile couldn't quite hide the stress lines around her eyes as she leaned down to speak quietly. "Mrs. Parker, I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we have another situation developing. Mrs. Rodriguez is questioning Mr. Martinez about the photography contract and payment arrangements. She's asking him to prioritize certain family groupings for the reception photos based on her understanding of who should be featured most prominently. I set down my fork, feeling the familiar tightness in my stomach that had become my constant companion throughout the wedding planning process. What did he tell her? He explained that his contract specifies the shot list and family priority arrangements that you provided. Mrs. Rodriguez seems to believe those specifications were made in error and wants them changed immediately. Looking across the room, I could see Patricia's animated discussion with Carlos had attracted the attention of other guests. Michael appeared at his mother's side, clearly trying to mediate whatever disagreement was unfolding. Emily, thankfully, seemed focused on conversations at the head table and appeared unaware of the brewing conflict. She wants the photography priorities changed in the middle of the reception? Yes. And when Mr. Martinez explained that any changes would need your approval since you're the client on the contract, she became quite insistent that there must be some misunderstanding. She asked to see the signed agreement. I glanced around the reception hall, taking in the elegant scene that was proceeding smoothly everywhere, except for the one corner where Patricia was learning yet another vendor considered me their actual client. The irony wasn't lost on me. At a reception, where she had relegated me to the back tables, she was discovering that every beautiful detail existed because of my planning and payment. I should probably go speak with them, I said, though the last thing I wanted was to create more drama during Emily's reception. As I stood to cross the reception hall, I passed table after table of guests enjoying the gourmet dinner, elegant wine service, and sophisticated ambiance. Several people stopped me to comment on what a beautiful wedding it was, how happy Emily looked, how perfectly everything was coordinated. Their sincere compliments about an event I had created but couldn't take credit for created a surreal feeling of displacement. The conversation at the bar had drawn a small crowd of curious family members by the time I arrived. Patricia was speaking in the controlled tone I had learned to recognize as a sign of barely contained frustration, while Carlos maintained the patient expression of a professional dealing with difficult clients. "Mrs. Parker," Carlos said with obvious relief as I approached, "perhaps you can help clarify the photography arrangements for Mrs. Rodriguez." Patricia turned to me, her face flushed with emotion I couldn't quite identify. Embarrassment, anger, confusion, or some combination of all three. "Mrs. Parker, there seems to be yet another misunderstanding about the wedding arrangements. Mr. Martinez is insisting that you have some kind of priority control over the reception photography." "Because she does," Carlos said matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Parker hired me, provided the shot list, specified the family groupings, and paid the full contract amount. She's my client." The small crowd around us grew quiet, family members and friends beginning to pick up on the undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with normal wedding day coordination. Michael looked between his mother and me with a puzzled expression that suggested he was starting to understand something unusual was happening, but couldn't grasp the full scope. "Mr. Martinez," I said diplomatically, "please proceed with the photography exactly as we planned. There should be no changes to the shot list or priorities we discussed." "Of course, Mrs. Parker. Should I begin with the family groupings we outlined? I believe you wanted to start with the bride's side and then move to combined family shots?" Patricia's intake of breath was audible. Family groupings that she outlined? The weight of Patricia's incredulous tone drew more attention from nearby guests. I could feel dozens of eyes focusing on our conversation, wedding attendees beginning to sense drama beneath the elegant surface of the reception. This was exactly what I had hoped to avoid, a public revelation that would overshadow Emily's celebration. But it was too late to contain the situation. Patricia's voice rose slightly as she addressed the growing audience around us. "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about the arrangements for this wedding. It seems various vendors believe Mrs. Parker is their primary contact, which obviously doesn't reflect the actual planning and financial coordination that's taken place." The word "obviously" carried the same dismissive tone I had endured for months, the assumption that someone like me couldn't possibly be the real power behind such an elaborate event. But now that assumption was crumbling publicly, and Patricia seemed determined to find some explanation that would restore her worldview to its proper order. Dr. Sarah Kim materialized at my side, her presence both supportive and protective. Behind her, I could see other guests beginning to gather, drawn by the obvious tension and raised voices. The elegant dinner conversation throughout the reception hall was quieting as more people became aware of the confrontation unfolding. Perhaps this conversation would be better held privately, Sarah suggested firmly. No, Patricia said, her voice now carrying a desperate edge. I think it's time everyone understood exactly what's been happening here. Mrs. Parker seems to have inserted herself into arrangements that were supposed to be handled by the families collectively. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. After months of being treated as an afterthought, of having my contributions minimized and my place in the family hierarchy clearly delineated, I felt something inside me shift. The protective instinct that had kept me quiet for Emily's sake was being overwhelmed by a deeper need to defend my dignity. Inserted myself? I repeated quietly, my voice carrying more clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over our section of the reception hall. Well, yes, Patricia continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing audience or the dangerous calm in my tone. Surely, you can understand our confusion when vendors keep referring to you as if you're the primary decision-maker for this wedding. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, Michael's family members, Emily's friends, relatives from both sides, all watching this moment unfold with fascination and discomfort. In the background, I could see Emily at the head table, still unaware of the drama, but beginning to look in our direction with concern. Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. There's no confusion among the vendors. They refer to me as the primary decision maker because I am the primary decision maker. I hired them, I paid them, and I coordinated every detail of this wedding. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I heard someone whisper, "Did she say she paid for everything?" And another voice respond, "That can't be right." Patricia's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, embarrassment, and then something approaching panic. That's impossible. The costs for a wedding of this caliber are substantial. Surely multiple families contributed appropriately. No, I said simply. I paid for all of it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the distant sounds of the wedding band warming up in the adjacent ballroom, the clink of glasses as servers continued clearing dinner tables, the normal sounds of a wedding reception continuing while this corner of the room had become frozen in shock. Michael stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. Mrs. Parker, when you say all of it, what exactly do you mean? I felt the weight of dozens of stares, the pressure of expectations and social dynamics that had constrained me for months. But looking at Michael's sincere question, at Sarah's encouraging nod, at the genuine curiosity rather than judgment in many of the faces around me, I made a decision to tell the complete truth. I mean, I paid for everything. The venue rental, the catering for all 150 guests, the band, the photographer, the flowers, Emily's dress, the transportation, the invitations, every upgrade and addition that was requested over the call. Past 8 months. The total cost was $78,437. The number landed like a physical blow among the assembled guests. Several people actually stepped backward. I heard someone gasp, "Oh my God!" and another voice whisper, "78,000?" Patricia's face had gone completely white. "That's not possible. No one person could. You're a nurse." The last 3 words carried the weight of months, of subtle disdain, the implication that someone in my profession couldn't possibly afford such extravagance. It was the most honest thing Patricia had said all evening, revealing exactly what she thought of my financial capabilities and social standing. Yes, I said calmly. I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for 30 years. I've worked double shifts, saved every penny I could, sacrificed vacations and luxuries, and yes, I borrowed money and took loans against my house to pay for Emily's dream wedding. Michael's eyes widened. You borrowed money? Mrs. Parker, why didn't you tell us? We could have what? I interrupted gently. Your mother made it clear from the beginning that she had concerns about my family's ability to contribute appropriately to a wedding that met your family's standards. I wanted Emily to have everything she dreamed of without anyone having to worry about whether I could afford it. The crowd around us had grown substantially, nearly half the reception. Guests had abandoned their dinner tables to witness this revelation. I could see Emily rising from the head table, beginning to make her way through the crowd with a puzzled expression that was quickly turning to alarm. Patricia seemed to be struggling to process what she was hearing. But the rehearsal dinner. We're paying for the rehearsal dinner. Yes, I acknowledged. The rehearsal dinner cost about $4,000. Thank you for that contribution. The mathematics of the situation hung in the air. Patricia's family was contributing $4,000 to a wedding that cost over $78,000, while treating the person who paid for 95% of it like a subsidiary participant. Frank Morrison appeared at the edge of the crowd, clearly drawn by the commotion. When he saw me at the center of the gathering, his expression shifted to one of professional concern mixed with personal sympathy. Mrs. Parker, is everything all right? Some guests mentioned there was a discussion about the arrangements. Before I could respond, Patricia turned to him desperately. Mr. Morrison, surely you can clarify this situation. Mrs. Parker is claiming she personally paid for this entire reception, which is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. Frank looked between Patricia and me, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into family drama, but obligated to respond. Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean by misunderstanding. Mrs. Parker is indeed our client for this event. We have records of all payments coming from her accounts. Emily finally reached our group, slightly out of breath from navigating through the crowd in her wedding dress. What's going on here? Mom, why is everyone gathered around you? The question I had been dreading all day had finally arrived. Emily stood there in her beautiful gown, surrounded by her wedding guests, looking between me and Patricia with growing concern. This was supposed to be her perfect day, and now she was going to learn that her perfect day had come at a cost that would impact my life for years to come. Sweetheart, I began carefully. There's been some confusion about the wedding arrangements that we're just clearing up. What kind of confusion? Emily looked around at the faces surrounding us, clearly sensing the gravity of whatever had transpired. Someone please tell me what's happening. Michael stepped forward and took Emily's hand. Emily, it appears your mother has been more generous with our wedding than anyone realized. Emily's eyes moved between Michael and me. What does that mean? The crowd had grown so large that other guests were standing on chairs to see what was happening. The elegant dinner atmosphere had completely transformed into something resembling a town hall meeting. I could feel the weight of nearly every wedding guest's attention focused on our little group. It means, Patricia said faintly, that Mrs. Parker claims to have paid for this entire wedding herself. Emily's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Her face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, understanding, and then horror. Mom, tell me that's not true. Tell me you didn't spend everything you had on our wedding. Not everything, I said softly. But yes, I paid for the wedding. Emily's eyes filled with tears that threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup. How much? Mom, how much did this cost? The crowd waited in breathless silence for my answer. These were people who had enjoyed an elegant dinner, who had complimented the beautiful venue and exquisite details, who had assumed that wealthy families had collaborated to create this perfection. Now they were about to learn that one woman, working as a hospital nurse, had somehow managed to finance everything they had experienced. $78,000, I said quietly. Emily's gasp was audible across the reception hall. Several guests actually started applauding, though whether it was for my sacrifice or Emily's good fortune, I couldn't tell. Emily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what I realized were sobs. "Emily, honey, please don't cry," I said, moving toward her. "This was my choice. I wanted you to have the wedding of your dreams." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you mortgaged your future for one day. How could you do that without telling me?" "Because I love you," I said simply. "Because seeing you happy on your wedding day was worth any sacrifice." The sincerity in my voice seemed to resonate through the crowd. I heard scattered murmurs of, "That's beautiful," and "What a devoted mother." But I also heard whispers of, "$78,000, and how will she ever pay that back?" Patricia, who had been silent during this exchange between Emily and me, suddenly found her voice again. "Mrs. Parker, I had no idea. If I had known you were shouldering this burden alone, we would have insisted on contributing more significantly." I looked at her. This woman who had spent months making subtle comments about my modest means and questionable place in their family's social circle. Would you have? Or would you have found reasons why the wedding needed to be scaled back to something more appropriate for my budget? The question hit its mark. Patricia's face flushed as she realized how her previous attitudes and comments appeared in light of this revelation. Around us, guests were beginning to understand not just the financial dynamics, but the social dynamics that had been playing out throughout the wedding planning process. Sarah stepped forward and placed a protective hand on my shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think this family needs some privacy to process this information. Perhaps we should return to our tables and allow them to have their conversation." But the crowd seemed reluctant to disperse. This revelation had transformed the wedding from a simple celebration into something much more dramatic and emotionally charged. People were invested now in seeing how this story would resolve. Emily wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders, every inch the bride despite her emotional state. "Everyone, thank you for your concern, but Dr. Kim is right. This is a family matter that we need to discuss privately." Her words carried enough authority that guests began to slowly move back toward their tables, though conversations throughout the reception hall remained focused on what they had just witnessed. I could see people leaning toward each other, sharing their shock and admiration in equal measure. As the crowd dispersed, only immediate family members remained in our small circle. Emily and Michael, Patricia and her husband Robert, Sarah, and myself. We stood there in an awkward silence, the weight of the revealed truth hanging heavy between us. Finally, Robert Rodriguez spoke for the first time that evening. "Mrs. Parker, this is extraordinary. I had no idea you had taken on such a financial burden for Emily and Michael's wedding. We are deeply grateful and, frankly, somewhat ashamed that we allowed you to carry this responsibility alone." His words were sincere, lacking the defensive tone that had characterized Patricia's responses. I appreciated his directness and the acknowledgement of the situation's inequity. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. I didn't do it for recognition or gratitude. I did it because I wanted Emily and Michael to start their marriage with beautiful memories." Emily reached for my hands, her touch gentle despite the trembling I could feel in her fingers. "Mom, we need to talk about how to handle this financially. You can't face this debt alone." "We'll figure it out," I said, the same words I had used to comfort myself throughout the planning process. But now, with the truth exposed and my daughter's awareness of the sacrifice, those words felt more hopeful than desperate. The band began playing in the adjacent ballroom, signaling that the dancing portion of the reception was about to begin. Emily looked toward the sound, then back at our family group, clearly torn between her desire to continue her wedding celebration and her concern about the revelations of the past hour. "Go," I urged her. "Have your first dance. Celebrate with your guests. We can discuss everything else tomorrow." "Are you sure?" I'm sure. This is your wedding day, and it should end with joy, not financial worry. Emily hugged me tightly, whispering "thank you" in my ear before taking Michael's hand and walking toward the ballroom. As they disappeared into the crowd of guests, making their way to the dance floor, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with money. Patricia approached me hesitantly. "Mrs. Parker, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. My behavior throughout this process has been inexcusable, especially in light of what you were doing behind the scenes." I looked at this woman who had made the past 8 months more difficult than they needed to be, who had questioned my place in the family while I was bankrupting myself for her son's happiness. Part of me wanted to let her struggle with her guilt, but a larger part of me was simply tired of the conflict. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope we can move forward with better understanding between us." As guests filtered into the ballroom for dancing, I remained in the reception hall for a few quiet moments. The elegant room that had hosted our dramatic revelation was now empty, except for staff clearing tables and resetting for the evening's festivities. Tomorrow, I would face the reality of my financial situation, the conversations with Emily about managing debt, and the long process of rebuilding my savings. But tonight, I had something I hadn't had in months: the recognition that I had made Emily's dream wedding possible. The woman who had been relegated to the 5th row was finally acknowledged as the person who had created every beautiful detail. The truth had emerged in a more dramatic fashion than I had ever intended, but it had emerged nonetheless. I walked into the ballroom to find Emily and Michael in the middle of their first dance, surrounded by guests and bathed in the warm light of chandeliers that I had selected. They looked radiant together, lost in their own world of happiness. Watching them, I felt a deep satisfaction that transcended financial stress or family politics. I had given my daughter the wedding of her dreams, and no amount of debt or difficulty could take that gift away from either of us. The truth about who had made it all possible was finally known, and for the first time in months, I could simply be Emily's mother watching her daughter dance with joy on her wedding day. The aftermath of the revelation settled over the reception like morning mist, visible but slowly dissipating as guests processed what they had witnessed. I found myself standing near the edge of the ballroom, watching Emily and Michael move gracefully through their second dance, while conversations throughout the room carried an undercurrent of amazement and newfound respect. The elegant evening I had orchestrated continued around me, but with a fundamental shift in how every detail was perceived. Sarah appeared at my side with 2 glasses of champagne, her expression mixing pride with concern. "How are you feeling, Susan?" That took tremendous courage. "Exhausted," I admitted, accepting the champagne gratefully, but also relieved. I didn't realize how heavy the secrecy had become until it was lifted. We stood together watching the dance floor, where several couples had joined Emily and Michael. Patricia and Robert were among them, though Patricia's movements seemed less confident than usual. Every few moments, her eyes would drift toward me, and I could see her still, struggling to reconcile her understanding of the evening with its reality. "Mrs. Parker?" A soft voice behind me made me turn. A young woman in an elegant black dress approached hesitantly. I recognized her as Jessica's sister, one of Michael's cousins from his father's side of the family. "Yes? I'm Maria Gonzalez. I just wanted to say that what you did for Emily and Michael is incredible. My own wedding is in 6 months, and after seeing this tonight, I have a completely different perspective on what family support really means." Her words were sincere, and I could see genuine emotion in her eyes. "Thank you, Maria. I hope your wedding day is everything you dream it will be. Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Would you be willing to share some advice about planning? Not just the financial aspects, but how you managed to coordinate everything so perfectly. Every detail tonight has been flawless." Before I could respond, another guest approached, then another. Word had spread quickly through the reception about my role in creating the evening, and what began as curiosity had transformed into something approaching reverence. People wanted to know how I had managed the logistics, where I had found such reliable vendors, how I had coordinated the timing so seamlessly. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations with guests who saw me entirely differently than they had just hours before. The woman they had politely acknowledged as the bride's mother was now recognized as the architect of one of the most elegant weddings they had ever attended. Their questions were detailed and respectful, seeking genuine advice rather than making polite conversation. Emily broke away from the dance floor and approached me during a lull in the band's performance. Her makeup had been carefully retouched, erasing the evidence of her earlier tears, but her eyes still held a mixture of gratitude and worry that touched my heart. "Mom, can we talk for a minute? Privately?" We stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the country club's gardens. The May evening was perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the rose gardens and the sound of laughter from the reception floating through the open doors behind us. "I still can't believe what you did," Emily said quietly. $78,000, Mom. I knew you were contributing, but I had no idea it was everything. I wanted you to have the wedding you dreamed of without worrying about costs. But at what cost to yourself? You've put yourself in debt for years. You've risked your financial security for one day. Emily's concern was palpable, and I understood her worry. The practical implications of my choices would indeed stretch far into the future. Honey, let me worry about the finances. Today was about launching you and Michael into your marriage with beautiful memories. That was worth every penny to me. But it's not just about money, is it? Patricia treated you like you were lucky to be included, and the whole time you were the reason any of it was possible. Emily's voice carried an edge of anger I rarely heard from her. She had you sitting in the back row at the ceremony you paid for. The hurt in Emily's voice revealed how much she had absorbed about the family dynamics during the wedding planning process. She had been caught between loyalties, trying to maintain peace while watching her mother be marginalized in ways both subtle and obvious. Patricia didn't know. She made assumptions, yes, but those assumptions weren't entirely unreasonable given what she could see of my lifestyle and income. I chose not to correct those assumptions. You chose to protect her feelings while sacrificing your own dignity. Her perspective was sharper than I had expected, and hearing her articulate the dynamic so clearly made me realize how much she had understood despite my efforts to shield her from the tensions. Michael appeared in the doorway, hesitating when he saw us in conversation. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Emily, your father is looking for you. He wants to do the father-daughter dance before he has to leave for his flight." David's presence at the wedding had been minimal but cordial. He had walked Emily down the aisle as planned, made a brief toast during dinner, and spent most of the evening networking with other guests. His contribution to the wedding had been exactly what I had expected: minimal financial support, but maximum expectation of credit and recognition. "We should go back in," Emily said, squeezing my hand. "But Mom, this conversation isn't over. We need to figure out how to handle what comes next." As we returned to the reception, I noticed the energy had shifted again. The band was playing livelier music, encouraging more guests onto the dance floor. The formal dinner portion felt like hours ago, though it had been less than 2. The bar was busy, conversations were animated, and the elegant atmosphere had evolved into genuine celebration. Frank Morrison approached me near the ballroom entrance. "Mrs. Parker, I wanted to check in with you about how the evening has progressed. I understand there were some unexpected developments during dinner. Everything has been handled professionally. By your staff, Mr. Morrison. The service has been exceptional." "I'm glad to hear that. If I may say so, in my 20 years managing events here, I've rarely seen such attention to detail in the planning phases. Your specifications were thorough and thoughtful, and the result speaks for itself." His professional acknowledgement felt different now that the truth was known. Previously, his interactions with me had been cordial but businesslike. Now there was a note of genuine respect in his voice, an appreciation for the complexity of what I had accomplished. "Mrs. Parker." Patricia's voice behind me was tentative, almost formal. I turned to find her standing with Robert, both looking somewhat uncomfortable but determined. "Patricia." "Robert." Robert stepped forward first. "We wanted to speak with you away from the crowd. This evening has been eye-opening for us, and we owe you more than just an apology." "You don't owe me anything. Emily and Michael are happy, and that's what matters." "No," Patricia said firmly. "We owe you recognition that should have come months ago, respect that should have been given from the beginning, and frankly, financial compensation for what you've done." The offer hung in the air between us. I could see the sincerity in both their faces, the genuine desire to address the inequity that had been revealed. But I also sensed something else, a need on their part to alleviate the guilt of their assumptions and treatment. The money was my gift to Emily and Michael. I don't want it to become a debt between our families. "But surely we can contribute retroactively," Robert pressed. "The rehearsal dinner cost us $4,000. That seems almost insulting compared to what you've invested." "It's not insulting. It's what you chose to contribute, and it was appreciated." Patricia looked frustrated with my refusal to accept their offers. "Mrs. Parker, please understand how this looks from our perspective. We've been accepting the hospitality of someone we treated poorly, enjoying the fruits of your sacrifice while remaining ignorant of what you were giving up. And now you know. The question is how we move forward from here, not how we compensate for the past." Sarah reappeared at my side, having observed our conversation from a distance. Her presence was both supportive and protective, a reminder that I had allies who understood the full scope of what had transpired. "Perhaps," Sarah suggested diplomatically, "this conversation would be better continued after tonight. This is still Emily and Michael's wedding reception, after all." Patricia nodded reluctantly. "Of course, but Mrs. Parker, we will be having a conversation about this soon." As the Rodriguez parents returned to the reception, Sarah shook her head slightly. "They still don't entirely get it, do they? They're focused on paying you back, as if this were a loan rather than a gift given freely out of love." She was right. Patricia and Robert's response, while well-intentioned, still carried undertones of transactional thinking. They wanted to settle a debt rather than simply acknowledge a sacrifice. The difference was subtle but significant. The evening continued with speeches, cake cutting, and the traditions that make wedding receptions memorable. Emily's college. Friends gave amusing toasts, recounting stories from their shared adventures. Michael's business school roommate delivered a heartfelt speech about friendship and love. David managed a brief, generic toast that mentioned supporting the young couple without acknowledging any specific contributions. When it came time to cut the cake, Emily insisted that I stand beside her and Michael for the photos. "You planned this whole reception?" she said loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You should be in these pictures." The cake itself was a masterpiece I had designed with the baker after multiple consultations. 3 tiers of vanilla bean cake with raspberry filling and buttercream frosting, decorated with sugar flowers that matched the ceremony arrangements. It had cost $1,200 and looked like something from a magazine spread. As Emily and Michael made the ceremonial first cut, I stood beside them feeling a profound sense of completion. Every element of this moment, from the crystal cake knife to the fine china plates to the elegant backdrop created by the reception decorations, represented choices I had made and expenses I had absorbed. But more than that, it represented the culmination of a dream I had shared with Emily since she was a little girl, imagining her perfect wedding day. Later in the evening, as the reception was winding down and guests began saying their farewells, Emily pulled me aside one more time. We sat together in a quiet corner of the reception hall, her wedding dress spread around her like a cloud of ivory silk. Mom, I need you to know something. When I think about today, when I remember this wedding years from now, I won't just remember that it was beautiful. I'll remember that my mother loved me enough to sacrifice everything to give me the day of my dreams. Her words brought tears to my eyes, the first I had allowed myself to shed all day. And I'll remember seeing you so radiantly happy that every sacrifice felt like a privilege. We're going to figure out the financial part together, she said firmly. Michael and I are both working now, and we won't let you face this debt alone. Emily, that's not necessary. Yes, it is. You gave me this day as a gift, and now we give you our support as a gift. That's how family should work. The simple wisdom in her words struck me deeply. Family should work as a network of mutual support, not as a hierarchy where one person sacrifices while others benefit. Emily had learned something important tonight about the true nature of love and obligation. As the last guest departed and the staff began breaking down the reception setup, I walked through the ballroom one final time. The elegant space that had hosted Emily's dream wedding was being transformed back into its everyday state, but the memories created here would last forever. Jennifer Walsh found me during this final walkthrough. Mrs. Parker, I wanted to personally thank you for being such a wonderful client to work with. Your attention to detail and clear vision made this one of the smoothest events I've ever coordinated. Thank you, Jennifer. Your team executed everything perfectly. I also wanted you to know that word has gotten out in our professional community about this evening's revelations. I expect you'll be receiving calls from other families seeking your advice about wedding planning. Your reputation for excellence is spreading quickly. The thought of helping other families navigate the complex world of wedding planning was intriguing. My experience, while financially draining, had taught me valuable lessons about vendor coordination, budget management, and the intricate logistics of large events. Emily and Michael left for their honeymoon the next morning, driving away from my house in Michael's car, decorated with traditional wedding ribbons and trailing cans. I stood on my porch watching until they disappeared around the corner, feeling the peculiar mix of joy and emptiness that comes when a long-anticipated event finally concludes. The house felt different without the constant buzz of wedding preparation. Activity. No vendor calls to take, no decisions to make, no timeline adjustments to coordinate. Just the quiet reality of my financial situation and the gradual process of rebuilding my life around the debt I had taken on. In the weeks that followed, the story of Emily's wedding became something of a local legend. The tale of the nurse, who secretly funded an elaborate wedding while being treated as a second-class participant, resonated with many people who had experienced similar family dynamics in their own lives. Maria Gonzalez, Michael's cousin, did indeed call for wedding advice, as did several other families who had attended the reception. Word spread through social networks about my organizational skills and attention to detail. Soon I found myself, with a small but growing consulting practice, helping families navigate wedding planning with both realistic budgets and elevated aspirations. The irony wasn't lost on me that my financial sacrifice had opened an unexpected door to supplemental income that would help address the very debt I had created. More importantly, it gave me a sense of purpose that extended beyond my hospital nursing shifts, a way to use the expertise I had developed through my own challenging experience. Emily and Michael returned from their honeymoon with a plan to help with my debt and a new understanding of family dynamics that would guide their own marriage. They insisted on taking over certain household expenses to free up money for loan payments, treating their contribution as an investment in family, rather than charity to an irresponsible parent. Patricia's attitude toward me underwent a complete transformation. The woman who had once questioned my place at family gatherings now sought my opinion on social events and treated me with a respect that bordered on deference. She frequently mentioned the wedding to friends as an example of extraordinary maternal devotion, though I suspected her praise was motivated as much by guilt as admiration. David, predictably, remained largely absent from the aftermath of his daughter's wedding. He sent a brief thank you note acknowledging the beautiful event, but made no offers to help with the financial burden he had largely ignored. His minimal contribution and maximal credit-taking served as a stark contrast to my approach, illustrating different parenting philosophies in ways that needed no explanation. 6 months after the wedding, as autumn painted the Connecticut landscape in brilliant colors, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Frank Morrison at Willowbrook Country Club, offering me a position as their director of special events. He had observed my organizational skills, attention to detail, and ability to create memorable experiences, and believed I could bring those talents to his venue in a professional capacity. The offer represented a significant increase in income and a chance to work in an environment where my skills would be fully appreciated. After 30 years of nursing, the prospect of a career change was both exciting and terrifying. But Emily's wedding had taught me something important about taking risks for meaningful goals. I accepted the position, beginning a new chapter that combined my love of detailed planning with my newfound understanding of event management. Working at Willowbrook allowed me to help other mothers create beautiful weddings for their daughters while building financial security and professional recognition. Emily visited regularly, often commenting on how different I seemed since the wedding. The woman who had spent decades putting others' needs before her own had finally learned to value her contributions and demand appropriate recognition. The truth that had emerged dramatically on her wedding night had changed more than just family dynamics. It had changed how I saw myself. On the first anniversary of Emily's wedding, we gathered for dinner at my house. Emily and Michael, now settled into married life, brought photo albums from their honeymoon and stories about their new apartment. The conversation inevitably turned to memories of the wedding, but this time the focus was on joy rather than financial stress. "You know what the best part of our wedding was?" Emily asked as we looked through pictures of the reception. "Tell me." "It wasn't the flowers or the food or the beautiful venue. It was the moment when everyone finally understood what an amazing mother I have. It took them long enough to figure it out, but they got there eventually." Looking at the photos of that perfect May evening, I could see past the elegant details to the deeper truth they represented. The woman in the navy blue dress standing proudly beside her daughter had learned that love sometimes requires you to stand up for yourself as much as sacrifice for others. Emily's wedding had cost me everything I had saved and then some. It had challenged my family relationships, exposed class tensions, and forced me to confront my own tendency to remain invisible rather than claim credit for my contributions. But it had also given me something invaluable, the knowledge that I was capable of creating beauty, managing complexity, and proving that love can overcome any assumption about what one person can accomplish. The debt took 5 years to fully repay, aided by my new career and Emily and Michael's contributions. But the lessons learned and relationships transformed by that one evening of truth-telling lasted much longer. Sometimes the most expensive gifts we give create value that far exceeds their cost, changing not just the recipient's life, but the giver's as well. The wedding that began with me sitting in the 5th row ended with me understanding that the back row was never where I belonged. Sometimes it takes a dramatic revelation to remind everyone, including yourself, that the person making the magic happen deserves to be seen and appreciated for their contributions. Emily's perfect wedding day became the foundation for a more honest and equitable family dynamic, proving that truth, however dramatically it emerges, has a way of creating relationships more authentic and sustainable than those built on assumptions and unexamined hierarchies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.